You are listening to the Outlaw Podcast with me, your host, Andrea Hall. I am a certified equine gestalt coach, speaker, 3-time author, and lawyer. I help women lawyers who are miserable in their career, struggling with mental and emotional health issues, wanting to have fun in their lives, and struggling to be selfish. After fulfilling my dream of being a criminal defense attorney and opening my own law practice right out of law school, I thought I had it all. While at the height of my career, my 18-month-old puppy died, and I thought, what am I killing myself for? Sometime later, I was diagnosed with a brain tumor, and my world turned upside down. It was in that moment I realized something had to change. This podcast is about sharing my journey with you about what is possible in your life outside the legal profession, stopping the adulting, and being able to play as a child, inspiring you to dream again. Let the journey begin. Of Outlaw. Today, I am mourning the erosion of the Constitution. And I'm going to be on a soapbox, that's for sure. So there's two things that I want to talk about. The first is that the criminal justice system is not infallible. And there was 2 cases in the last week that have really sent me into a tailspin and caused me to once again question our criminal justice system and what I had fought for the last 14 years. And the first is an article that was published by a colleague of mine who owns the Swain Law Office in Douglas County, Kansas. And there is a gentleman who spent 23 years in a Missouri criminal justice system. And he was in prison for 23 years, and he had been basically professing his innocence. And in 1996, he was charged for a double murder, and the evidence against him was basically weak. And he had an alibi that was solid, and the case was in his favor and had only grown stronger since his co-defendant was convicted of the murder in March of 1997 and was sentenced to life without parole. However, this individual continued to remain locked up. And ultimately, after he was in prison for 23 years, he was involved with the Innocence Project, which has been a great nonprofit organization that has exonerated numerous people. And this individual ultimately in 1996, a former Kansas City cop who was then running a nonprofit organization got a call from a man who said he'd actually witnessed the shooting. And the caller claimed he had seen 3 men drive off afterwards. And he told the man to send the tip into the police. And ultimately, they found out that, I apologize, I'm kind of reading what the article said. He was 21 at the time of the murder, and as I previously stated, he had a pretty solid alibi, and he said he was awakened early that morning by his sister Nikki, who had stayed with him the previous night and wanted to drive his 1993 Toyota Corolla to work. By mid-morning, he and his stepfather had successfully started his other car, an unreliable white 1981 Oldsmobile Delta. They took his sister's young son, DJ, and a then girlfriend drove another vehicle. And after picking up the keys at around 11:30 or noon, he then took his girlfriend home, and they then drove the Corolla to another county, and the story goes on from there. And unfortunately, he was charged with the murder, and his co-defendant, like I said, was also convicted. And ultimately, in 2009, there was a federal hearing where someone confessed to the murders and furnished critical information to the courts. And in this confession, he described how he had met a friend of his the morning of the murder who drove him to Bryant's home, and they were armed with handguns. And let's see, it goes on to further talk about the evidence and what brought to the conviction. However, ultimately, he was now, after 23 years in prison, exonerated. And the sad thing is that we have had something very similar here in Colorado to a gentleman that was convicted at the age of approximately 25, yet the murders had happened 10 years before that. So he would have been 15 when the murders happened. And there was evidence that was very alarming that would go to show that it was another adult male, not a 15-year-old, that could have committed this murder, as well as the heinous act that was done to the woman, the removing of her genitalia with precision, which would have been done with some sort of a scalpel, which would have never been in the hands of a 15-year-old, especially the hands of a 15-year-old who had been living in a trailer park very near to where the body was found. However, ultimately, the prosecution withheld evidence from the defense team, and the jury was looking at somebody who was an adult, not a 15-year-old kid. And ultimately, he was convicted, and the DNA evidence that ultimately came out after he had spent numerous years in prison showed that he was not guilty. And we believe that the evidence would have supported another man who had also been arrested shortly after this gentleman had been arrested, and he ultimately committed suicide. However, he was charged with numerous sex offenses, and it would go to the MO of the murder victim in this case here in Colorado. And he ultimately was exonerated and received, I believe, $1 million for every year that he had been incarcerated, which came to, $10 million. And unfortunately, yes, $10 million is nice, yet $10 million doesn't bring your life back. $10 million doesn't afford you the opportunities to go through life. He has missed the development of a cell phone, the technology, laptops, social media, things of that nature, things that can never be replaced. And ultimately, this is the sad state of affairs of our criminal justice system, which ultimately brings me to my second case. And this is even more heartbreaking to me. And that is that Texas just recently, as of last week, I believe it was August 21st, killed a man who was on death row. And the reason that this is so heartbreaking to me is I firmly believe that there is plenty of people that are on death row that are innocent. And how can it be okay to kill someone to show that killing someone is wrong? And as I stated, this was another case that was being worked by the Innocence Project. And 165 people have been exonerated from death row. 165 people. What if that was your son, your daughter, your mother, your father, a friend, a loved one in general that could have easily died? And in this case, this gentleman, based on what I've been able to ascertain through the articles and people's comments, there was sufficient evidence to show that he was innocent. And there was 20 years of this evidence that had been accumulated. And unfortunately, the United States Supreme Court basically said, too bad. We are going to let the execution proceed. And the facts of that a little bit were that he was convicted in the year 2000 for the death for rape and murder of a young lady. However, since his conviction, he had always maintained his innocence, and they had found that the scientific evidence used to actually convict him was not reliable, that it was junk science, and yet the United States Supreme Court still said that they were going to allow this execution to happen. And unfortunately, I see this often where people are wrongfully accused. And we have situations like these two cases where people profess their innocence, and yet somehow a jury has found them guilty, and the criminal justice system has failed them through appeals. And now, like the individual in Texas, the criminal justice system and ultimately the Supreme Court has failed this gentleman and his family. And, the last thing he said, which absolutely breaks my heart, as he was being put to death was, let me get back to here, I apologize. Was, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they have done. And it's so true, because so many times in our criminal justice system, it's really not about justice. And this is what I tell my clients all the time, that it is really just us. And this is one of the reasons why I decided to ultimately leave the criminal justice system, was because there was no justice. And it was frustrating to see prosecutors being able to withhold evidence because the ends justified the means, or that the police didn't do a proper investigation, and my client was having to hire an investigator to do a proper investigation. It happens all the time where evidence is very one-sided, and cases are not all the same. I have had cases come into my office where I'm like, this is weird, because just 2 weeks ago, a client's case wouldn't get charged with the same allegations. And now I have a client sitting in my office whose being accused and criminally charged with the same or similar allegations. And it's absolutely frustrating because it's not a one-size-fits-all, and yet there are so many injustices. And these two that I've shared in the stories in tonight's episode are just one of many of the cases that I have seen in my career as a criminal defense attorney. And it's very sad, and I see it all too often for judges, prosecutors, and ultimately the mourning and the erosion of the Constitution on a daily basis. So thank you for listening to my rant this evening about the criminal justice system and how it is just us. Thanks for tuning in to another episode. Feel free to leave me a comment if you know somebody who's been wrongly accused or you have experienced some sort of traumatic experience in the criminal justice system. Thanks. Have a great evening. Thanks for tuning into another episode of Outlaw. There is life after litigation. If anything I said in this episode resonates with you, call for a free exploratory session to see how I can help you. My horses will give you instantaneous feedback, unlike traditional talk therapy. You will shift your awareness into real time with the help of a horse. The horses are like lie detectors, flushing out limiting beliefs with a swish of their tail, a shift of their 1,200-pound body, or a simple unwillingness to move. Horses have a way of seeing into the window of our souls. Horses have been connected to humanity since the dawn of time. Their hearts can heal and mend our broken hearts. Simply standing in their presence can change our lives forever, putting the puzzle pieces back together and returning us to wholeness. Horses are restoring the parts of us that have been missing. You can call us at 970-682-4405 to set up your appointment today. Want to be inspired daily? See about our latest events or purchase a copy of my books? Go to our website at www.witherswhisper.com. That's www.witherswhisper.com. Or you can follow us on any social media venue at Withers Whisper. Until the next episode, listen to the whispers.